Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for making it to IPI for what should be a very interesting discussion. So I am Jérémie Labbé, Research Fellow in charge of IPI's Humanitarian Affairs program, and I am indeed very happy to welcome you to this discussion with Amin Awad, Director for the Middle East and North Africa Bureau of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, based in Amman, Jordan. In addition, Amin also serves as UNHCR's Regional Refugee Coordinator for the Syrian operations, which will be the main focus of our discussion today. This event is the latest of IPI's Humanitarian Affairs series, which a number of you are familiar with, that offers a platform for humanitarian coordinators and other senior humanitarian practitioners to meet with the humanitarian and diplomatic community in New York. This series aims to provide first-hand information to members of the UN community on the reality of contemporary humanitarian crises, and by extension, to discuss with seasoned practitioners on some of the greatest challenges to humanitarian action today. This series has so far featured humanitarian coordinators for Somalia, for Sudan, for the Sahel region, and for Afghanistan, as well as Amin Awad's predecessor as Regional Refugee Coordinator for Syria, Mr. Panos Mountis, who came here slightly more than 1 year ago. It is therefore with great pleasure that we welcome today Amin Awad to hear his perspectives on the priorities and challenges to responding to what is certainly the biggest humanitarian crisis of modern times and the greatest refugee exodus in recent history. To give you a better idea of the exponentially deteriorating situation in the region, when we had Panos Mountis here on January 17th, 2013, the number of registered refugees was 642,000. Today, we are talking about more than 2.4 million, a fourfold increase that remains below the real number of Syrians who have sought refuge in neighboring countries, but were not registered with the UNHCR. And the situation is not expected to improve anytime soon, with estimates of more than 4 million refugees by the end of 2014. As the number of refugees is continuously growing, they represent an increasing burden on neighboring countries, especially Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt, that host the highest number of Syrians. In a country like Lebanon, they represent today close to 25% of the population, 10% in Jordan, putting a formidable strain on the economy, the public services, infrastructures, and affecting the demographic balance and the stability of these countries. To give you an example and a personal anecdote, when I was in Lebanon in last October as part of a short fact-finding trip for IPI, one of the persons I spoke to reported a popular belief in Beirut's streets in Lebanon that the country was hosting 2 million Syrians, half of the population. So while this figure is certainly highly exaggerated, it reflects a widely shared perception that the country is literally flooded with Syrians. And beyond that, it also reflects rising concern within the population. There is today a growing awareness and recognition that the response to the Syrian crisis must go beyond a refugee response. While immediate refugee needs must certainly still be met, international organizations, aid agencies, and regional actors must also address the needs of host communities and support host states in absorbing hundreds of thousands of Syrians. So this is one of the numerous challenges in responding to the Syrian crisis that Amin Awad will discuss today. While I will not go into details of Amin's extensive experience, you can find a short biography in your papers in the list of participants that was distributed to you. It is worth noting that Amin Awad has had a long career with the UNHCR, an agency that he has served for 25 years, both in various challenging field positions and at its headquarters in Geneva. In the last decade only, he served as UNHCR coordinator for the Iraq operations from 2003 to 2005, based in Geneva, I believe, representative of the agency in Sri Lanka from 2005 until the bloody end of the conflict in 2009, and director of the Emergency, Security and Supply Division in Geneva from 2009 until taking his current position in July 2013. With this brief introduction, I would now like to give the floor to Amin Awad for a 15 to 20 minutes presentation before opening the floor to our audience for a Q&A session. Amin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks to you and for the useful introduction and overview, but thanks to the colleagues who came to attend this during very difficult weather conditions. So it shows the power of IPI, the IPI convening power against all odds, and I am thankful. I'm thankful to IPI for organizing this one, but also the one in Jordan, and for always finding innovative ways to bring attention and focus to some of the issues surrounding this type of crisis, and especially the Syria one now. So thank you very much to you. I will use the 15 minutes to give you basic information on the state of affairs now as far as the refugees are concerned in surrounding countries, those who are in exile, and a bit on the impacted population, be it IDPs and non-IDPs inside Syria. And I'll talk about figures, challenges, areas that we're focusing on, changing, I would say, implementation modalities, the type of sectors that we're prioritizing, the type of areas that my colleague just mentioned, the shift also in demographics, and the shift of numbers, the increase of the number of refugees by about almost 2 million during the last 12 months alone, and the way also they moved into surrounding countries and the places they chose as places of residence have brought a lot of changes that, of course, make us always review the way we provide assistance and how we build our implementation modalities and how we prioritize with the government and increasingly with the host communities themselves and the refugees, but also with our partners. Yes, indeed, we have about 2.4 million refugees now in the surrounding countries. These are registered refugees. We have an elaborate system of registration. It's time consuming because we profile these refugees. We look at vulnerabilities, size of families, number of family members, their origins, and we have what we call level 1, 2, and 3 registration. And the more we increase the level, the more we look and zoom into the vulnerabilities. Also, this is the first time we use a new technology. Registration is done through iris scanning, and that, of course, maintain the integrity of the registration, the data, but also it helps in us determining vulnerabilities when we are doing assessment for assistance and for protection. But also it helps us to track the movement of people, and it also gives us a level of check and balance when it comes to assistance, that there is no fraud or mismanagement or double serving. And also these cards, at the end of the day, they do not allow the refugees only to have access to services, but also these are identity cards approved by the government of origin, of the government of asylum, that allow the refugees the freedom of movement. As many of them, they came without documents or expired documents, and that provides also another level of protection, if you like. I wanted to talk about registration in details because this is the first time we really spend time to register people in such massive numbers. As I said, 2.4 million people, and the number is growing. We have a massive number of staff, hundreds of them that are working in surrounding countries to register people, interview them. There are tens of registration centers and hundreds of computer terminals to make sure that people are registered as they come in. We brought the backlog in a place like Jordan from 3 or 4 months of waiting to about 2 or 3 days now. In Lebanon, it came down from about also 4 or 5, 6 months to only 30 days backlog. So any refugee can receive their papers in 30 days. And we are working on narrowing that gap. Lebanon is a challenge for us because there are many crossing points, and the number of refugees that are coming to Jordan are faster and bigger than anywhere else in the region. So there are challenges there. Now, the numbers that are not registered, and according to government estimates, we have another 600 to 700 that are not registered. That brings the number, the total number of refugees, to about 3 million. We, through the regional response plans, which we started designing since August 2013, we had 35 sectors in 5 countries. Hundreds of people were working on this plan together with governments, NGOs, development actors. 155 organizations contributed to the various sectors, the plan and the design of it. And from the outset, we said it should be comprehensive, should not be written in a hurry, should be inclusive. The analysis should be sound. We bring the development actor with us, and we fully engage the governments. And it should not only be an appeal document, it is an assessment document and of needs, but also it's an advocacy document as far as the protection issues in there. The appeal came out the way we wanted, thanks to the coalition. It also, the byproduct of that became a very solid and comprehensive coordination mechanism and system, and a regime, if you like. And the total needs that we have put in this appeal, in the regional response plan, stand at 4.3 billion. That makes it the highest appeal ever in the history of humanitarian action. And not only this year that became the biggest one, last year also was described as the biggest relief, the humanitarian appeal in the world. 4.3 billion for refugees outside Syria. The OCHA and colleagues working inside, including UNHCR and the other operation agencies working inside Syria, where they work through a parallel mechanism called the SHARP. They put the figure of needs at 2.3 billion inside Syria. That brings the total number to 6.5 billion. There are challenges there. I will come in a moment to the issue of development and linkages with development actors and financial institutions as the refugees move from camp kind of a setting increasingly to host communities and mingle with the local population and bring about challenges also to the host communities and the host countries. So I'll come to that in a moment. But I want to share with you, aside from the number, the type of challenges we are facing now and the refugees are facing, including in the host communities, some of the protection issues, the nexus, humanitarian and development, the concept of burden sharing, as far as these governments who are hosting refugees are concerned, and some of the challenges and the concern that we're also having. The number of refugees now in the surrounding countries, as I said, they are about 3 million, 2.4 million registered, but 85% of those refugees now live in host communities. And the number of refugees in some municipalities or districts outnumber the number of local populations, especially in places like Lebanon, when in some instances you'll see a village of 5,000 people of original population populated by another 20,000 refugees. That, of course, one example of many. In big town, in metropolis, it's in villages, in rural areas, and that put a lot of strain on these communities, and of course created tension between the local population and the refugees. There is competition for resources. There is exhaustion of capacities, for example, when it comes to education, health, water supplies, an ever-growing problem of, in some instances, of waste management, for example, as a vivid example that you will see in some of the villages. And of course, then that brings the whole question of assistance. How do we provide assistance to refugees and host communities in a way that the refugees benefits from direct assistance, but also the host communities and their local government benefit from some kind of assistance to help them to sustain the pressure, but also help these countries to continue keeping their borders open, adhering and observing their international obligation, and try to stay the course. To stay the course, because now we're looking at a longer-term plan, in the sense that the humanitarian situation of those refugees and displaced persons inside Syria is going to be protracted. It's going to be protracted. Today we are in the third, going to fourth year of conflict. It's going to be protracted because we still do not see a light at the end of the tunnel. There is no political settlement. There is no ceasefires. And there is no access to some of the population. The war continues. And as a result, people leave their homes to seek asylum abroad or go to other areas that are safe. Not only that, there is also a secondary movement that takes place, not because of the war and the security situation only, and the killing that takes place, but also because people lost their livelihood and they cannot have access also to services. These are all combined elements making people flee. In a country, from a country that is known to be a country that at some point was the second largest recipient of refugees in the world, it received many of the Iraqi refugees and Palestinians, and also it's known to be one of the highly advanced countries in the Arab world with a very high human capital and at the high end of a middle income, what we call middle income countries. And as far as the development scale, it was also a country that known to have done well, and it has histories of thousands of years, as we know. So the movement, as is causing anxiety among countries in the region. Lebanon, given the fragility of Lebanon itself, no government, the ethnic, sectarian, religious, racial diversity of Lebanon makes it difficult. But also, before this crisis, Lebanon had its own internal political issues, and today they do not have government. And we are in transition. The incidents of security that we have seen during the last few weeks, few months, and now the last few weeks seems to be increasing rapidly, making us think, did really the conflict inside Syria contribute to a spillover of sectorial fighting and ethnic tension and religious sectarian tension, in regional polarizations. These are issues that we would, as we go along, we will learn more. However, the cost, if we look at all of this aside from the security issues and the spillover, Lebanon puts the cost of hosting the refugees at $7.5 billion. Not the services that they provide to them, but the cost as far as Lebanon's loss of direct or indirect investment, trade, strains on the infrastructure and services, loss of tourism, and other related loss of income, unemployment, and strain on the services. Jordan put the figure at $2 billion, while Turkey reported that it has spent so far $2.5 billion on construction of camps, delivering services, security, and support to those also in the host communities. That just gives us a bit of a glimpse of the magnitude of the issues. If we look at the demographics of the refugees themselves, we have, out of those 3 million people, 2/3 are women and children. We just reported not long ago 1 million refugees arrived to surrounding countries. Now they are 1.1. And we have a lot among the refugee population. If we have a look at our registration, we find that there is a big number of vulnerabilities among women. There is a big number of women, sector of the population that are heads of household. They do not have access to income. They do not have help. Some of the children that they care for are traumatized because of the war. And as I said earlier, we are in the third year going to fourth, and a lot of them, the majority of them, not all of them, the majority, the vast majority, missed out on education. So the challenges now are very clear as far as on the protection side of things, that we have to continue to keep the borders open, access to territories. We keep engaging the governments, the 5 governments that are receiving refugees now. We also play a catalyst role in making sure that there's structural kind of support, there is financial support, there is bilateral support, what we call burden sharing with these governments to make sure that as we look at a longer term crisis, we also look at the sustainability or how to sustain that. The support now we're giving to refugees because of these characteristics and the new dynamics and the demography and the presence of the refugees now with host communities, we're moving from assistance that's based on material support to cash-based assistance. And that is done in a way that will be based on vulnerabilities and needs in the various areas of Turkey and Lebanon and Egypt and Jordan and northern Iraq. And cash will be distributed to refugees, families. For example, one of the many examples, cash for rent, cash for vulnerable groups, cash for winter. There are also monetization programs. But also coupled with that, to offset the presence of the refugees, we work on what we call host community development projects in these small villages and towns and metropolises to help in the service sector or in a small infrastructure of roads or waste management or expansion of electricity networks or water networks, and so on and so forth. Aside from working with the authorities, the line departments in the areas of education and health to improve and expand and keep the integrity of these systems. Now, having said that, let me backtrack and say why cash, aside from the issues that I've just alluded to or I mentioned. Cash also gives the refugees a choice to get on with life as far as their needs, the way they prioritize them, as opposed to non-food items, blankets, tents, stoves, floor mats, hygiene kits, and so on and so forth. These are necessities, and the refugees may need them if they're in a camp setting or in host communities. But it will not help them to go out and use it in a way that they can have mobility, they can take transport, they can move from one place to another, they can find employment, they can change their diets and balance their nutritional need of their children, buy over-the-counter medicine. There is a phenomenon now that we have spotted in the region. There is a begging phenomenon among the Syrian refugees. Tens of thousands of refugees you find today in southern Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq are begging. And if you profile some of these part of the population, in a very quick sampling, we found out that a lot of them are begging because the material-based assistance does not solve all the problems. You step out of your house to beg for that 2 Jordanian dinars, which is about $3, or 500 Lebanese lira to buy over-the-counter a medicine from a pharmacy for your child. Our in-kind assistance will not give you that. To transport yourself from one place to another in search for a job, you need money. To buy food, you need money. And even some of our partners in other sectors have realized that they have to move to a voucher or a cash system. Now working together closely with WFP, who is moving also from in-kind food to cash and voucher. And that will give the refugees a wider and a broader spectrum of opportunities to buy the type of food that fit their needs. Now, another benefit from the targeting of the assistance and shifting to something that is more relevant to the existence of those refugees is that when we spend hundreds of millions of dollars in cash assistance, that will inject money in the small communities. Will contribute to the stimulation of the local economies that we see in these villages and towns. and will also help increase the purchasing power of some kind in these communities and offset the burden that brought about by the refugees on the businesses and the small communities in these 5 countries. Now, coupled with this, we're looking at the third level of assistance to offset the impact of the presence of refugees in the rural and urban areas, and that is by working with the governments and the local municipalities in devising and implementing quick impact projects, community-based projects to help the areas that I mentioned earlier, be it road, be it electricity, water, repair of building, expanding education or health system. That also will create, the byproduct of that will create jobs for smaller companies, for individuals, for labor, for skilled laborers, for NGOs who are willing to help. And we will spread the overall goal and the catalyst role we play with others in the comprehensive approach that my colleagues alluded to. We're also working closely with the financial institution like the World Bank, where we did joint assessments together with the government. We have now a platform, it's called the Host Community Platform in Jordan, managed by the government, the Ministry of Planning. In Lebanon, there is a host community task force, also look at projects, assessments, areas, sectors, implementation modalities, and so on and so forth. And we're also calling on government to look at bilateral assistance in a burden sharing efforts. And that was undertaken by the High Commissioner in what he calls the high-level segment during the EXCOM, the Executive Committee, or the Board of Governing UNHCR back in September, where they brought together the ministers of foreign affairs of surrounding countries to bring attention to the problem of refugees in their countries, but also to call on the international community to support these countries to sustain their stamina and their ability to keep their borders open and receive refugees. So it's not only sustaining the refugees and helping the local communities, but also to make sure that borders are open and people have access to safety. There is also parallel initiatives, but they're integrated, they're not in isolation. There is a comprehensive regional approach, which is now launched and assessment are being taken. And the Regional Humanitarian Coordinator, Nigel Fish, is working on that with us, the humanitarian agency on the one side and the development agency on the other. And the idea is to bring the humanitarian and development access and linkages also on the short term with the national plans and the development frameworks of these countries. So in Lebanon, they call it the stabilization plan, which we agreed with in the government. There is a platform where agencies are sharing their assessments. One example, UNHCR undertook an assessment of households of refugees. We did about 100,000 visits to make sure and verify the way how those refugees live. What are their priorities, vulnerabilities? Do they have savings? Do they have access to employment? How are they coping with nutrition, with food, children, trauma? And that has been very useful exercise that's now being used by many of the development organizations to try to devise strategies and plans to respond. So 2014 will see the biggest change ever, shift in our approach from a pure humanitarian action to an action that embraces and incorporates development and cash-based assistance to support the refugees and the local communities. Some of the challenges that the refugees are facing, big challenges, as I said, education. The No Loss Generation is an initiative that is being floated now a few months back. It's championed by Gordon Brown. But to make this a reality really and expedite the implementation of it, we're asking for perhaps local champions in these countries or international known figures to push this plan forward and turn it into a reality as soon as possible in the different countries, but also down to in the different local municipalities and villages and towns. There is a need for resources, be it cash, material, assistance, curriculum, teachers, classrooms, transport, feeding for these children who may go back to school, but also a campaign to stimulate the interest again of children in education. There are also, aside from education in this No Loss Generation initiative, there is an element of psychosocial support. A lot of these children are traumatized, and maybe resumption of education is not their priority anymore. And there is an element also of child protection from recruitment, from sexual abuse, from forced labor, or any of the problems that they may face on a day-to-day basis. Some of the other challenges also we're facing is children separated from their families or guardians. There are about 8,000 of them. And also some of the issues on the protection side of things that women are facing, given their vulnerabilities, their lack of access to employment, income, vulnerability also of young girls, early marriage, a lot of phenomena. The phenomena of begging that I mentioned earlier, I did not see, and you will not see men begging. There might be some, but 99% of them are women and children that you find at the corner of the street, at the traffic lights, in front of shopping malls, or even airports, and intersections in front of apartment buildings are women that are trying to fetch something for their children. So there is a long list of challenges, from assessments to delivery to protection issues. One more challenge that the population faces in the Middle East, an area that traditionally known as far as climate to be moderate. As you know, late last year we had what they call Storm Alexa, which brought temperature to below zero in places like Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey. Luckily, we had a winterization plan. It was not intended for such severe winter, but we had a winterization plan where we invested about $217 million in insulated tents, stove, kerosene, warm clothing, thermal blankets. Also, as far as infrastructure and work, a lot of resources and time was spent on waterproofing many of the collective centers where refugees live in Lebanon, in Turkey, Jordan, and other places. I will stop here and take questions.
Well, thank you very much, Amin, for what was a very comprehensive presentation on the many conflicting priorities, the many different challenges that UNHCR and its partners have to face in delivering the response in the region. Before giving the floor to our guest here, I would like to ask you one question on an aspect that you haven't touched upon, I believe, which is the role of regional actors in the response. And I mean by regional actors, states from the Gulf, for instance, that have the means to help these countries. I mean, regional organizations as well. What about the League of Arab States, the Gulf Cooperation Council, or the Organization for the Islamic Cooperation? Could you tell us a bit more about this and how you reach out to these actors, how to coordinate with them in terms of response? What do they do in the field? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a valid question. The GCC, the Gulf countries, they engage in bilateral assistance directly to the governments of the region. And we have seen that recently, in particular with Lebanon and Jordan, but also in a big way with Egypt, beyond the crisis of the refugees, but also with Egypt's own crisis. There are also the regional or the local Red Crescent societies of the Gulf, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and they're playing a big role. They have a lot of resources, and they have been contributing in tens of millions of dollars with in-kind contribution and helping in building some of these camps, in providing prefabricated shelter. Just recently, there were $20 million worth of assistance to Lebanon from Qatar, the Qatar Red Crescent. So there are, and also from the United Arab Emirates. So while their assistance may not be channeled through the UN or the NGOs, it's channeled directly to the government that they in a bilateral way. And I think they have a responsibility, more or otherwise. These people are in the region. They're also the region engulfs the whole politically or otherwise. The conflict has dynamics, and I think the region as a whole, the Arab world, is involved one way or another in that. So there is a need for these regional entities to be engaged.
And in the same vein, as a follow-up question to my previous question, are there some like formal coordination mechanisms with those various sectors? I heard you saying that they prefer bilateral assistance, that they would engage directly with host governments rather than going through UN channels. But are there some coordination forum to make sure that the action of these different actors is complementing each other rather than duplicating each other, that it is using maybe the same standards?
Standards and coordination is always an issue, and I don't think no matter how much you want to coordinate, you'll always find gaps, and you may find people who are acting in a bilateral manner. Or, however, when delivering assistance, we notice more often than not these entities are checking with the UN country team or with the headquarters of some of the UN agencies to verify whether what they are planning to send is needed. At the beginning was a bit unorganized, but now it's increasingly organized. Just before I open the floor to questions, perhaps I go back and say a couple of things about Syria itself. The situation for the UNHCR does not take the lead in Syria. We take the lead in two sectors. One is the protection, and the other one is the shelter and the non-food items and the distribution of that. There are a lot of people in no government-controlled areas that are considered to be IDPs. There are people in besieged areas, as you know, and there are people in areas that are called hard-to-reach areas. Hard to reach because there are many checkpoints and difficulties and risks on the route. Many times in a 100-kilometer stretch, which I have seen myself and experienced, you'll find more than 30, 40, 50, 70 checkpoints. Different people with different allegiances, different ideologies, objectives, and sometimes also there's no predictability. Today they're there, tomorrow that checkpoint will disappear. 10 men and a jeep and guns, they could be a rebel group. Do they control a big piece of land? Do they have the support of the population that they have control? We don't have any idea. So and mapping these groups is ever increasingly difficult because they're elusive and they move from one place to another. There are Islamist groups who invited themselves from outside and took control of some areas. There's some other radical groups who came also and either forged alliances or worked independently. And then we have the government on one side and the Syrian Free Army and some of the legitimate, perhaps, elements. So it's a very difficult situation for humanitarian action. Increasingly, we heard in the besieged area of people who are facing starvation and malnutrition. There are problems and mishaps when it comes to polio. Now that there are concerted efforts to address that, but polio vaccination, like many of the other vaccinations, is difficult, bring its own challenges. You need a cold chain. You don't do one round of vaccination, you do 5 or 6. But then as you have prepare that, and you have your logistics in order to take care of a specific part of the children population to do the polio vaccination, you find that many of them are malnourished, that you cannot vaccinate them before you bring their condition to a certain level. So all around, these are difficulties and challenges that our colleagues are facing on the ground, from access to delivery to security and the same thing we see outside, health, education, employment, access to services is also experienced inside Syria. I'll stop here and I take your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amin. So now we will move on to our Q&A. Just a few housekeeping remarks before moving on to the Q&A. First, I would like to ask all participants to please take a few minutes to fill our feedback form, which is attached at the back of your participants list, or that you can find on the credenza at the back of the room. In addition, I think the UNHCR has left a few documents also that you can take with you at the back on the credenza there if you want to have some facts and figures about the Syrian crisis. Then, as for the question, the questions themselves, please make sure to mention your name and affiliation when you're taking the floor. Keep the microphone steady, please, to ensure good recording, particularly that we are webcasted, as you know. So in order to have the questions heard through the webcast, we need you to keep it steady in front of your mouth. And last, keep your questions and comments relatively short and straight to the point, please, so that we can have a good discussion. Thank you. So I'm taking questions now. All right, I see already 3. I will go by round of 3 if it's fine with you. Starting with the lady down the 3rd row, then maybe this lady on the 2nd row afterward, and I will go there on the 3rd row as well to Javier.
I'm Karen Colvard from the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. I wonder, are these refugee communities or any part of these refugee communities politicized? Do they have a strong political or even military interest in what happens in this hot war in Syria? And do you see that causing any problems within the refugee communities themselves, or any problems or even possibilities for peace negotiations as time goes on?
On the 2nd row here, please.
Yes, hi, my name is Karima and I work for UNDP. Oh, stand. Okay.
Yes, and then I will ask those asking questions if you can please stand so that people can see you. Thanks.
I just have a comment to add regarding recently there was Kuwait 2, the conference, the pledging conference in Kuwait, which was co-hosted by the Secretary General and the Emir of Kuwait, where predominantly, I think, Arab donors or Gulf countries pledged much of the $2.4 billion. And this was a second conference that was followed up to the first one last year, which 1.5 billion were pledged. Just that's all. And just to say that there's a task force from that pledging conference for those who pledged, I believe, 70 million or 80 million and upwards, that is going to be basically convened. And that UN agencies are very active on this front regarding not just the humanitarian, but also bridging to the development side of the response. Thank you.
Thanks for your comment. Then Javier from the Spain mission.
Yep. Thank you, Jeremy. I'm Javier Gasol from the Spanish mission. Thanks so much for this very comprehensive presentation. I would have 2 comments or questions. The first is related to the very approach to the crisis. I mean, we all agree, and the IPI presentation today says that this is not only a refugee crisis or even not mainly a refugee crisis. So there are many other actors that should be involved in the response. And my question goes to the relationship and the coordination you're having with other UN agencies, more development-oriented, such as UNDP, for instance. It is very good to know that you're already working on a long-term plan, but I would like to, and your relations with the host governments, but I would like to know if there are any particular steps that you are taking with those agencies who might want to change or at least adapt their priorities in these countries, in Lebanon or in Jordan. So my second question would go to the role of women and girls, and relating to the participation of women in the finding of durable solutions, and more particularly on how you're addressing the problem of sexual and gender-based violence in the camps, not only within the refugees, but also with the IDP population. Thank you.
So, Amin, I think there are 3 questions and 1 comment on Kuwait 2 conference, and maybe you might want to add something in that regard.
The first question was about whether the refugee communities are politicized and polarized. They have their orientation, but we don't see, for example, a major effort by an opposition or a political party of one kind or another to really try to rally these refugees. The fact that they are dispersed, the majority of them are dispersed in many parts of the region, is very difficult to reach them. And our contact with them is usually through registration and the points of assistance delivery. But we haven't seen the type of politicization or polarization that we've seen with some other refugee populations, especially those who are in camps, which is easy to target. These are captive individuals in camps, But there we don't, and I think their priorities themselves are very much are on the daily survival. But also, if you look back to the history of Syria, it hasn't been an open society of political opinions and development and growth of independent opinions or political parties that were acting independently. What we hear of is the Syria Free Army, the Syria opposition. But what is the color, shape, or the orientation of those political parties? If it is to us, are a bit not clear and not developed. For the refugees, I can tell you, with no also access to communication or information, it's not clear. So I don't think there is a choice that they can make easily. The issue of the Kuwait II, indeed, Kuwait II took place on the 16th of January. $2.4 billion were pledged. Thanks to the charities and the non-governmental organizations, they also raised another 400 or 500 million. However, these remain pledges, and we hope that these pledges are translated to hard commitment. There is a high level, what they call top donors group for those who contributed the most, and I think there are about 10 or 12 of them, and they engage now in coordination as far as their contributions, and also it will continue throughout the year, I think, not only to look at what's contributed, but also to coordinate among themselves what to be contributed in the future and link to the development side of things. I think that was the intention. On the development and humanitarian nexus, there is a whole group, as I explained now, with the Ministry of Planning of Jordan, the Ministry of Planning of Lebanon, in Turkey, and in Egypt. We have now counterparts, and we have task force working on host community support exclusively. We're working also through the municipalities who have control over their own territories as far as budgets, as far as services, and the needs come from them, and sometimes from the refugees through them. So there is a huge now movement. The cash assistance is considered a kind of a development assistance, if you like. That is also is done as far as assessment in tandem with the work of the other development agencies. Now, we signed an agreement with UNDP in the 6 countries, and so we did with the World Bank. And our collaboration is ever increasing, and now you'll find more groups working in different areas that they have never worked in before. Not only the sectors that we know as humanitarian sectors, but on employment, on credit schemes, on cash groups, on monetization. So there is a move to that direction, and there is a coordination that happens at all levels. On the women side of things is a big issue. Governments are aware of the problem. Our protection agencies, partners, or UNHCR are seized by the issues. There were research and many assessments as to the condition of those women, and also the mechanisms that are being put in place to counter the exploitation, the domestic violence, the traumatization of children and women themselves, those who are victims of gender-based violence, safe houses, awareness campaign, psychosocial support, and big chunk of the regional response plan and the SHARP inside Syria now goes toward the support and protection of women and children in surrounding countries and in Syria.
So we'll go for a second round of questions, starting with Kay down from UNDP, the lady on the first row, and then I see one hand down in the middle.
Hello, Kai Stabel, no longer UNDP, but independent research. So my question is on the asylum aspect. So reading the regional response to Syria and seeing how the host communities are dealing now also with the Palestinian refugees from previous conflicts being moved again, and looking at the longevity of the conflict in Syria, how are you seeing the response to seeking asylum beyond the Middle Eastern countries? What is the response from the European countries, the response from the Americas and other places? Because we are aware that it's going to be a long conflict. We're looking at the number of kids who've been out of school for so long. What is the willingness to share the burden, so to speak, beyond the countries such as Lebanon, which is already feeling such a big chunk of it? Thank you.
then we'll go to the first row. Yes.
Hello, my name is Caroline Ziadeh. I'm the DPR from the Permanent Mission of Lebanon. Since my country has been mentioned several times, I'm not here to reiterate the well-known position of Lebanon concerning keeping up our borders open, continue our partnership with the international community in general, UNHCR in particular. But I would like, as the previous speaker mentioned, if you would be able to highlight a little bit more the concept of burden sharing and relocation of the refugees in light of what has been done by Germany to accept hosting additional refugees from Lebanon and other host countries. That's one thing. Secondly, I would like to hear your comments and views on what could be done by the Security Council in addition to the PRST, which has been adopted on the last October 2013. What would be your advice and your message to the members of the Security Council? What could be done here to assist you in providing your services, not only to the refugees, but as well to build up the resilience of host communities? Thank you.
And we'll take a third question, or technically it will be a fourth question, I think, from the gentleman there in the middle.
Hello, my name is Benji Rogers. I'm with UNDP. My question is about the sectarian divide of the refugees. Are Sunni and Alawi populations combined? Are they, when they stay with host families, are they Sunni? Are the Sunnis staying with the Sunnis? Are the Alawis staying with the Shiites? How is that divided?
Thank you for the brevity of your question. Amin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think the questions on the burden sharing and did the refugees seek refuge beyond the surrounding countries, there are two levels to this. One, refugees, they try to seek refuge whenever they can. If they can cross borders, they can reach far away, they will reach. We have, unfortunately, some unfortunate instances where refugees try to cross the Mediterranean going toward Europe, and they have drowned. Some they made it, some drowned. Some are subjected to abuse by smuggling groups. They charge high amount of money, and they may still not reach their destination and may drown during voyage. Unfortunately, also, as far as reaching far away and finding refuge elsewhere, that hasn't been as encouraging as it should have been, and as we have seen in other refugee crises. There are only 30 to 35,000 refugees that now live away from the region, and they're spread over 91 countries, even as far as islands of the Caribbean or Latin America. And the largest number was taken by Sweden. There was also a question as far as burden sharing for these countries to keep their border open. The resettlement program, which is one of UNHCR durable solutions element and a pillar of our operations traditionally, and many of the donors countries, receiving countries, are versed with this. We haven't seen a generous response to resettlement. And resettlement usually is not a solution. Even if 200,000 people resettle, which is only less than 10%, at least an opportunity for those who have severe and acute type of vulnerabilities, for family reunion, for medical cases. And it is a solution. When you look at a vulnerable, impacted refugees, it's just one too many. There is a humanitarian admission program and a resettlement program. They are in their infancy, and we hope that working together with the receiving countries will have an ever-increasing number of places for refugees who are in need and who meet the criteria of this program, the receiving countries and ourselves. Security Council resolution. I think it's not my place to talk on behalf of Security Council. It's a different entity. It's not even the UN. It's of member states. But the PRST and the follow-up, I think we reached a dead end there. It's not binding. But if there's anything to be done by the Security Council, is to try to find ways and means and concentrate on finding a lasting solution as far as the security situation in Syria, through ceasefire, through a political, lasting, and durable settlement.
And I think there was a last question about the composition of the refugee population, whether there are more mostly Sunni.
I really don't like to talk about that, and we do stay away from categorization of refugees and their race or region or sectarian orientation, because it's just we will be one way or another. Unfortunately, intentionally or not intentionally, trying to fuel something that we should not. So for us, a refugee is a refugee, a Syrian refugee is a Syrian refugee, regardless of his race, color, sectarian background, they are refugees. So please, let's stick to that.
Thank you. At least it is very clear. If I may just build on, on this question, you mentioned the fact that the conflict is becoming protracted, that refugees are not only fleeing violence anymore, not only insecurity, but also loss of livelihood, loss of access to basic services in Syria. In that respect, do you see a change in the composition indeed of refugees? Here I don't want to politicize the discussion, certainly not, but on the contrary, coming back to the basics of humanitarian action, which is basing our response on the needs. Do you observe rising needs on all sides of the population linked to this loss of livelihood?
Yeah, good question, because now the profile of the refugees, as far as their background, rural areas versus urban areas, professions, we get more and more now people with high level of education, be it professors, teachers, doctors, nurses, skilled labor, and the numbers are rising. So hopefully now we see a good outlook and approach by Jordan, who wants to invest in the human capital of the refugees. Now they are in Jordan and they want to utilize them. And here they looked at a self-enlightened interest. Rather than complaining about the refugees and their presence to the international community, the Jordanian turns that around to say there's an opportunity to utilize the Syrian human capital that's now in Jordan, be it guest workers, be it skilled, high level of professionals, be it engineers or doctors or otherwise. So we see a change also, and I think the same will happen in other places.
Thank you. So I would like now to take another round of questions, starting with this gentleman on the first row, and we'll move to Jonathan on the third row.
Thank you very much. I'm Ahmed Fathallah, the ambassador of the Arab League in New York. I want just to, as a follow-up to some issue which was raised, it's concerning sometimes the duplication of in-kind assistance, because we as Arab League, we have noticed that sometimes there are duplications and sometimes there are lacks of assistance. For instance, if you speak about medicine, you can find extra medicine in some refugee community here or there in Jordan or in Lebanon and so on. For that, I want to emphasize the role of the Arab League concerning this issue, because lately we have tackled this issue and we are playing a coordination role, because as it has rightly mentioned, most of the assistance given by the Arab countries are based on bilateral assistance. And this created a kind of duplication. Therefore, we are trying to coordinate as Arab League between the Arab countries, not to have this duplication and to give the right assistance to the right people. That's one comment I wanted to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for the clarification. Then we'll move on to Jonathan Andrews.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Andrews from the Interagency Task Force on Syria. Thank you, Amin, for the comprehensive briefing. We've heard a lot about refugees, 3 million refugees. I thought with UNRWA and UNHCR in the room, we should also maybe hear a little bit about what UNRWA, especially what UNHCR was doing in the region beforehand. And there were refugees, and I guess there are still other refugees, and quite a big program to try and deal with those. Obviously, a lot of new constraints and conditions on them, perhaps progress being made. It'd be good to hear a little bit about that, especially, I guess, in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Is there a third question? Somebody who has like a burning issue? This lady there.
Yeah, it's Rhonda Haubin, and I'm a blog columnist at Die Tageszeitung at the taz.de website. And my question has to do with the two parts. One part is, are you talking about the money funding in Syria as well? And the second part is that I thought the one time I felt we were really touching reality was when you talked about having to go through all those checkpoints in Syria. And I think somehow that's a very important issue. And I don't see how we can just be discussing this without somehow understanding the outrageous situation with people being kidnapped, people, the things that are going on in Syria that are being and somehow, and the arming that's coming outside of Syria. And I don't know how, in your situation, you have to be neutral. I understand that, but somehow there's a situation that's outside of a normal catastrophe because there's a foreign intervention that's going on. So I don't know, is there some way that can become part of understanding this situation? Because otherwise, it becomes that it can't be understood. So I don't know what you do about that, but that's my question.
Thank you. So Amin, back to you.
Okay. Is intervention by our colleague from the Arab League is valid. There is a role for the Arab League to play in this kind of crisis, be it on the capacity building side or negotiation, or even the humanitarian side of things when it comes to coordination of assistance bilaterally or even multilaterally. So we appreciate that. On the second question, I think, was very much related to Syrians, other refugees in the region. Was it by Jonathan?
Yes, by Jonathan, about other refugees prior also to the Syrian crisis,
and the Palestinians. I'm glad that Jonathan raised this question. On other refugees in the region, Syria, as I said during my intervention, received about 1 million refugees, mostly Iraqi, during the period 1991, the first Gulf War, up to the time the Syrian crisis itself erupted. And there were Iraqi refugees also putting the same impact on the surrounding countries as the Syrians today, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, and in other places. So that indeed combined the efforts and multiplied the efforts of the agencies that have been already there, UNHCR for sure. And on the Palestinian issue, of course, UNRWA has a really tremendous task facing financial challenges, but also frustrated by the lack of solution for the Palestinian refugees. Some of them are under siege in places like Yarmouk, facing starvation and malnutrition. Some of them are not having access to territories. They're stopped at borders. And the majority of them who now are in Iraq, this is an area outside the area of operation of UNRWA. There are about 10,000 of them. In the Yarmouk camp, there are 18,000 of them. There are some that are stranded in border. There are some that are not documented in other parts. There are some that took to the sea with the Syrian refugees themselves and drowned or never made it to their destination. And when they did, they were separated. So the Palestinians today really is one of the most vulnerable, I would say, population in the world, and they're facing a lot of challenges. The last question was access, and how do we have access from one place to another? For us, it is really a challenging question because there are so many groups, as I said. Maybe there are 280 groups today fighting in Syria. To really know who's who, holding what territories, what checkpoints, what is their allegiances, what is their orientation, is very difficult for us to determine. And we continue to map these groups. Our people work through all means that they have to have access to pass one point after the other to deliver. That's why areas are becoming increasingly difficult to reach, and others are being besieged. So it's a very difficult and complex. Even in Bosnia, it was very clear who's who. But in Syria today, it's very difficult.
Is there any other questions from the floor? If not, I will seize the opportunity to ask you another question, Amin, about the role of the diaspora, if any. I mean, there is quite a relatively important, there was a relatively important Syrian diaspora, including in the United States, prior to the crisis. And we all talk in humanitarian development circles about the importance of remittances and the financial the financial amount that it represents that dwarfs humanitarian assistance funding generally. So what's the role of the diaspora in this refugee crisis, and is it something that you are composing with?
A lot of the diaspora group stepped forward and created, as I have seen in Washington, for example, several groups that have created non-governmental organizations, and they're collecting money and sending assistance inside Syria or to the refugees in surrounding countries, or even some of the diaspora, of course, traditionally in that part of the world are remitting money to their families. But as far as remittances, it is something that is really not visible. You won't know what a household is receiving unless there are proper assessment in income and saving, and some they may disclose, some may not. But the diaspora have a big role to play, and I know that there is a big, old and established Syrian diaspora in the Americas and in Europe and in the Arab world, especially in the Gulf countries, and they have a role to play.
Thank you. So if there is no final question, I will ask my own final question, which is maybe very anecdotal, but I think it can be quite symbolic of the time you spend of the Syrian crisis. When I introduced you, I mentioned the two hats you have. Your director for the Middle East and North Africa of the UNHCR, and regional refugee coordinator. How much time do you have to give to your hat of regional director of the UNHCR? How much time are you spending on the Syrian crisis as such?
The Syrian crisis is taking, if I can do it in percentage, it's really difficult, but it's taking a lot of time because of the fast-moving situation, evolving, the many actors on the ground. It takes more than 50% of my time. And then don't forget, I keep reminding the world, our organization, that there are other crises in the Middle East, the area that I cover, that are not visible, but every day our colleagues are facing challenges with security, with access, with funding, with ever-increasing humanitarian needs in places like Yemen, Libya, for example. There's to a large extent, a breakdown in security, becoming an increasingly insecure place. We have refugees in Mauritania, for example. There are movement across the sea in North Africa. We have still the Sahrawi refugees who've been there for 38 years, and they're in need of assistance and investment in human capitals. And unfortunately, because these crises somehow are forgotten and overtaken by big ones like in CAR, Central African Republic, South Sudan, and now Syria, these programs do suffer shortage of funds, and one tries to keep the balance.
Well, I think it's a perfect way to conclude this discussion. Despite the severity of the crisis in Syria, there are some other crises also going on around the world, unfortunately, and we shouldn't forget them. Thank you very much, Amin, for being with us today. Thank you to all participants to have braved this terrible weather today and make it to IPI. I know that it's not only the free lunch that motivated you.